My fiancée made me sign a prenup to protect her inheritance. For years later, I made $8 million and used her own clause to give her nothing. Before we go on, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which city you're tuning in from. When my fiancée asked me to sign a prenuptial agreement, I thought it was the most uncomfortable conversation we'd ever had. But I wasn't offended. I actually understood. Laura came from a wealthy family. Her grandfather had built a large real estate company, and, as she herself had explained to me several times, a significant part of that fortune would end up being her inheritance. I didn't have that kind of history. I grew up in a normal family. I worked from a young age, and when I met Laura, I was trying to get a small tech company off the ground that wasn't yet producing many results. So when one night she told me we needed to talk about something important before the wedding, I already imagined where the conversation was going. We were sitting in her apartment kitchen when she said it. My family wants us to sign a prenup. She said it in an almost practical tone, as if she were talking about choosing flowers for the wedding. To protect your inheritance? I asked. She nodded immediately. Yes. Then she added something else. It's nothing personal. They never say it's personal, but it always is a little. Still, I didn't argue. If that makes you feel more at ease, that's fine. She seemed surprised there was no fight. Really? Yes, because at that time my financial situation was quite simple. I had my company, some modest savings, and a considerable amount of uncertainty about the future. She, on the other hand, had an inheritance that was probably worth several million. The prenup seemed logical. A few weeks later, we went to the office of the lawyer who had prepared the document. The man spoke for almost 20 minutes about clauses, protected assets, separation of property, and other legal terms that I honestly barely listened to. My attention was on something else. Laura seemed very focused. She asked specific questions, made sure everything was clear. I, on the other hand, was thinking about the launch of a product my company was preparing at the time, something that if it worked could change my life, but at that moment, it was still just a possibility. The lawyer finally turned the document towards me. If everything is clear, we just need your signature here. Laura looked at me. It's just to protect what I already have. I took the pen and signed without reading, not out of absolute trust, but because at that moment I simply didn't care too much. If we ever got divorced, she would protect her inheritance. It seemed fair. What neither of us knew that day was that a small clause hidden in that document was going to completely change our story. Because 4 years later my company was sold for $8 million, and when our marriage began to fall apart shortly after, that same prenup that Laura had demanded I sign ended up being exactly the reason she received absolutely nothing. For the first few years of marriage, the prenup was something we practically forgot about. It never came up in conversation again. It never became a topic of discussion. It just existed. Our life went on. I worked long hours at the company trying to make it grow. It wasn't easy. There were months when I thought everything was going to fail, moments when money was tight, and days when I wondered if I'd taken the right path. Laura, on the other hand, had a much more stable life. Her family supported her. She had access to resources, and there was always a safety net behind her. At first, that wasn't a problem, but over time, a difference in how we saw things began to show. For her, my work was something uncertain, something that could work or not. For me, it was everything. I remember one night in particular. I was excited because we had finally managed to close an important deal with a client. It wasn't huge, but it was a big step for us. I came home and told her enthusiastically. She listened to me for a few seconds. Then she said something that I didn't give much importance to at the time. That's good, but don't get your hopes up too much. The phrase stuck with me, not for what she said exactly, but for the tone. It wasn't support, it was caution or something closer to skepticism. Those kinds of comments were repeated over time. Your company is still very small. You shouldn't depend so much on it. You always have to be realistic. They were never direct attacks, but they weren't words that built anything either. Meanwhile, I kept working. More hours, more effort, more risk. Until finally, after almost 4 years, everything changed. A large investor became interested in the company. The conversation started informally, then became serious, and finally reached a point where the word buyout began to appear on the table. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted to be sure. But when the deal was closed, the final figure was something I hadn't even expected. $8 million. I remember perfectly the moment I told Laura. We were in the living room. I explained everything. The deal, the sale, the amount. For the first time since I'd known her, I saw her completely surprised. 8 million. I nodded. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then she smiled. A different smile from the ones I'd seen before. I knew you could do it. That phrase made me think. Because it wasn't true. She hadn't said it before, but at that moment I decided not to give it importance. I thought she was just happy for me. And for a while everything seemed to improve. Laura's attitude changed. More interest, more support, more closeness, but something inside me had already started to notice small details. Comments about money, questions about accounts, interest in how the profits were structured. Nothing too obvious, but enough for me to realize that something was changing, and over time that change stopped being subtle, because when money entered the equation, our marriage began to deteriorate faster than I imagined. And that's when the prenup, that document I signed without reading, came up in conversation again, but this time not in the way Laura expected. The first time Laura mentioned the prenup again was more subtle than I expected. It wasn't an argument or a direct demand. It was during a seemingly normal conversation about money. We were in the kitchen one night, talking about what to do with the profit from the sale of the company. Investments, properties, possibilities. It all sounded good, until she asked a very specific question. Where are you going to keep the money? The way she said it caught my attention. In several investments, I replied. Nothing definite yet. She nodded slowly. All in your name. That question wasn't casual. Yes, I replied. It's my money. There was a small silence. Then she smiled, but it was a different smile. Well, we'll see. I didn't say anything at that moment, but that phrase stuck with me. We'll see. Over the following weeks, the topic started to come up more often. First, it was indirect comments. Now that we're in a different stage, we should reorganize our finances. Maybe we should see how things are distributed in the future. It's important that we're both protected. The word protected seemed interesting to me because that same word had been the reason why I signed the prenup in the first place, to protect her, but now it seemed she wanted to protect herself from something else. One day, she finally said it directly. I think we should review the prenup. There it was. Why? I asked. Things have changed. I nodded slowly. Yes, they changed because my company worked. She didn't respond to that directly. That agreement was made under different circumstances. It was made because you wanted to protect your inheritance. Yes, but now, she stopped. Now what? She took a deep breath. Now, there's much more at stake. Then I understood everything. It wasn't about protecting what she already had. It was about accessing what I had built. The agreement is still valid, I said. Laura looked at me intently. It's not fair. That word made me let out a small laugh. Not of mockery, of disbelief. It was your idea. There was silence. At that time, it was different. No, at that time you had more than me. That was the truth, and we both knew it. Circumstances change, she insisted. And agreements should change too, she added. I shook my head. No, that was the first time the conversation became really tense. Because for the first time, I wasn't willing to give in. You can't keep everything, she said. That phrase completely changed the tone of the conversation because she was no longer talking about reorganizing anything. She was talking about dividing. I'm not taking anything from you, I replied. I'm respecting exactly the agreement that you wanted to sign. Laura didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then she said something I didn't expect. Then maybe this was a mistake. I looked at her. The prenup? She shook her head. The marriage. The silence that followed was heavy because at that moment I understood something very clearly. The problem wasn't the money. It was that now the agreement no longer suited her. And what happened next was when I finally decided to do something I should have done from the beginning, read that document I had signed without thinking. And when I did, I discovered a clause that completely changed the game. That same night, I looked for the prenup. It wasn't easy to find. It was stored in a folder with other important documents that I had practically not touched since the day I signed it. For years it had been just that, another piece of paper. Until now, I sat at the dining room table, opened the folder, and began to read it for the first time with real attention. Page by page, clause by clause. At first, everything was exactly what I vaguely remembered from that day in the lawyer's office. protection of inheritances, separation of prior assets, individual responsibilities. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing surprising until I got to a section I didn't remember at all. In fact, I didn't remember hearing anything about it. It was an additional clause, small, almost hidden among longer paragraphs, but very specific. And the more I read it, the more sense it began to make. It was a future asset protection clause. In simple terms, it stated that any significant increase in wealth generated by one of the parties would be considered exclusively of that party, as long as there was no direct and demonstrable contribution from the other. I read it again more slowly, then a third time, because what it meant was very clear. My company, my work, my sale, everything I had built during those 4 years was completely covered by that clause. And most importantly, I hadn't asked for that clause. It had been included by Laura's lawyer, probably as a way to protect the future growth of her own inheritance. But now it worked in my favor. I leaned back in my chair and let out a small laugh, not of mockery, but of irony, because the same document that had been designed to protect her was the one that now protected everything I had built. At that moment, I understood something that completely changed my way of seeing the situation. I didn't have to fight, I didn't have to negotiate, I didn't have to justify anything. The agreement was already written, and it was legally clear. The next day I called my lawyer, I explained everything. I read him the clause. There were a few seconds of silence on the other end of the line. Then he said something that confirmed what I already suspected. That clause is pretty solid. What does it mean exactly? That if she can't prove she contributed directly to the growth of your company, that money is completely yours. I was silent for a few seconds. And if she tries to claim something, she can try. He paused for a moment. But it's not going to be easy. I hung up the phone with a very different feeling than I had had days before. For the first time since that conversation with Laura began, I had clarity. That night, when I got home and saw her sitting in the living room, I knew that the next conversation was going to be completely different. Because this time I already knew exactly what position I was in, and what she was going to say next was going to make it even clearer why that marriage was no longer fixable. That night, I didn't wait too long. I didn't want the conversation to drag on for days or weeks, as had happened with other issues in the past. Laura was in the living room when I arrived. She had her laptop open and several sheets on the table. When she looked up, her expression was no longer the same as before. It wasn't surprise, it was determination. "We need to talk," she said. I nodded. "Yes." I sat across from her and placed the prenup on the table. I noticed her eyes immediately move to the document. "I read it," I said. There was a small silence. "Good," she replied. "Then you know we need to update it." I shook my head. "No." Her expression changed slightly. "What do you mean, no?" I opened the document and pointed to the clause I had found the night before. "This is still in effect." Laura looked at the paragraph, read it in silence, then read it again. And it was at that moment that her expression changed completely, because she understood exactly what it meant. "That doesn't apply like that," she said quickly. "Yes, it does. You can't interpret it that way." "I'm not interpreting it. It's written." The atmosphere in the room changed. The tension was now completely evident. "That clause was meant for something else," she insisted. "Maybe, but you can't use it like that." "I'm not using it. It's already there." There was a long silence. Laura got up from the sofa and began to walk around the room. It was something she did when she was frustrated. "This isn't fair," she finally said. There was again that word. "Fair? It was your agreement," I replied. She stopped in her tracks. "At that time, it was different." "Yes." I looked at her directly. "At that time, you were the one who had more." She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it. "Now that it's changed," I continued, "you want to change the rules?" She crossed her arms. "Relationships don't work like that. Contracts do." That phrase made her turn completely towards me. "Are you really going to treat this like a business?" I thought for a few seconds before answering. "You did, the day you brought that document." The silence that followed was heavier than any before, because this time there was no way to soften what was happening. Laura finally spoke. "Then there's nothing more to discuss." "No, you're not even willing to negotiate." I shook my head. "No." She looked at me for several seconds. Then she said something that I somehow already expected. "Then this isn't going to work." I didn't respond immediately because deep down I already knew that. No, I finally said, and for the first time since it all began, the conversation didn't end in an argument. It ended in something much clearer, a decision, because what neither of us said out loud at that moment was that this marriage had just ended. The days after that conversation were strangely silent. There were no shouts, no long arguments, no that kind of drama you imagine when a marriage breaks down. It was something much colder, more calculated, more definitive. Laura stopped trying to convince me. That was the first thing I noticed. She no longer mentioned the prenup. She no longer talked about reorganizing anything, but the change in her attitude was evident, more distant, more reserved, more strategic. And that made me realize something important. She had stopped trying to change my decision and had started thinking about how to win in another way. A couple of days later, she confirmed what I already suspected. "I spoke to a lawyer," she said one night, almost without emotion. I nodded. "Me too." We looked at each other for a few seconds. "This doesn't have to be complicated," she added. "We can do this right." That phrase sounded reasonable, but I no longer trusted that tone. It depends on what you call right, not destroying each other in the process. I didn't answer because at that point it was no longer about destroying anything. It was about closing something that clearly no longer worked. "I'm going to file for divorce," she finally said. Okay. There was no reaction from me. No surprise, no anger, nothing. And I think that's what affected her the most, because Laura was used to me reacting, to me arguing, to me trying to fix things, but not this time. This time I just accepted reality. The silence between us became heavier. "Is that all?" she asked. "Yes." She frowned slightly. "I thought you'd at least say something else." I looked at her. "What do you want me to say?" She didn't answer because there was nothing else to say. The process officially began a few days later. Lawyers, documents, dates, everything moving surprisingly fast. But what struck me most was how Laura began to change her strategy, because although she no longer spoke to me directly about the money, her lawyer did. They tried to argue that she had indirectly contributed to my success, that the marriage had created an environment that allowed my company to grow, that in some way there should be compensation. Nothing aggressive, nothing exaggerated, but clearly an attempt to get around the clause I had found. When my lawyer explained their strategy, I only asked one question. "Does she have a chance?" He shook his head. "Not much." He paused. "The agreement is quite clear." I felt something I didn't expect. It wasn't relief, it was confirmation, because at that moment I understood that everything that was happening wasn't a fight. It was simply the result of decisions we had both made years ago. She wanted that agreement. I signed it without reading, and now we were both living with the consequences. But what happened at the next hearing was the moment when everything stopped being a legal strategy and became completely personal. The hearing didn't last more than an hour, but it was enough for everything to be clear once and for all. I entered the room with my lawyer without expecting much. For me, it was just another step in the process, but Laura arrived differently. I don't know if it was the way she walked, her expression, or simply the tension she was carrying, but it was clear that this day was important to her. We sat on opposite sides. We didn't even look at each other at first. It was the lawyers who started talking. Laura's presented his argument calmly. He spoke of indirect contributions, of the marriage as a unit, of how the economic growth of one could be interpreted as the result of the other's support. It was a well-constructed speech, almost convincing, but there was a problem. The document. When my lawyer spoke, he didn't elaborate too much. He simply pointed to the clause, read it, explained its scope, and then did something that practically closed everything. "Both parties signed this agreement voluntarily," he said, "and the clause is explicit regarding the individual ownership of assets generated without demonstrable direct contribution." The judge asked to see the document. He reviewed it for a few minutes in silence. Those minutes felt longer than they were. I could feel the tension in the room. Finally, he looked up. "The agreement is clear." That phrase was enough. But the judge continued. "There is no evidence presented that demonstrates direct contribution to the growth of the business." He paused. "Therefore, the assets in question remain as individual property." Silence. A heavy silence, because that was it. There was no discussion, no alternative interpretation, no room for maneuver. Laura didn't say anything at first, but when we left the room was when everything changed. "Did you really do this?" she said with a mixture of disbelief and anger. I stopped. I looked at her. I didn't do anything. She shook her head. You know exactly what you did. I signed what you wanted. That made her silent for a few seconds. You could have done the right thing. That phrase made me let out a small laugh. The right thing? According to whom? She didn't respond immediately. According to us. There is no us. That was the first time I said it out loud. And I think that's what hurt her the most. Because one thing is to argue about money. Another very different thing is to accept that the relationship no longer exists. Laura took a deep breath. You're keeping everything. I looked at her intently. No, I'm keeping what I built. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was final, because at that moment we both understood that there was nothing left to discuss. The divorce was only a matter of time, and what happened next was simply the closing of something that had actually ended long before. The divorce was finalized a few weeks later, without more hearings, without more discussions, without unexpected twists, just signatures, documents, and one last meeting where everything was officially over. It was strange. After everything that had happened, I expected to feel something stronger. Anger, sadness, relief. But it wasn't like that. It was quieter, as if something that had been broken for a long time finally stopped holding on. Laura and I didn't speak that last day. There were no emotional goodbyes, no attempts to fix anything, just two people signing the end of a story that, to be honest, had not existed for a long time. Before she left, she said something, not angry, not annoyed, just tired. I never thought it would end like this. I looked at her for a few seconds. Me neither. And it was true. But something else was also true, that many things had led to that point. Not just the money, not just the prenup, but everything that came before, the differences, the ways of seeing life, the small decisions that accumulated end up breaking something bigger. When I left that building, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't victory, it wasn't satisfaction, it was clarity, because for years I thought the problem had been the money. Then I thought it had been the prenup, but no. The problem was much simpler. We were never in the same place. We never built from the same foundation. And when things changed, each of us reacted according to who we had always been. Laura wanted to protect what was hers. I protected what was mine. It was that simple. Over time, I invested the money from the sale, not impulsively, not to prove anything, just to build something stable, something that was really mine. Sometimes, when I think about everything that happened, I remember that moment in the lawyer's office, the pen in my hand, the document in front of me, and how I signed without reading. At that moment, I thought it didn't matter, and I was right, but not in the way I imagined, because that paper didn't define my marriage. It only revealed what was already there. And the most ironic thing of all is that the agreement she wanted to protect her future ended up being exactly what protected mine.